Right, circling back to our top story, U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff war has split over into the legal arena.
Yeah, an appeals court reinstated his sweeping tariffs just hours after a federal trade court blocked most of them, ruling the levies illegal. And the latest decision means the tariffs remain in effect temporarily during the appeals process. And for more analysis, let's speak to Deborah Elms, the head of trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation. Deborah, thanks for your time. And just want to start off asking you, how significant is the appeals court's suspension of the International Trade Court's ruling and the speed at which it moved to reinstate the tariffs while the appeals process is ongoing?
I think that's a bit less shocking, actually, than the original ruling. Two different courts now have ruled against President Trump's imposition of tariffs using this Emergency Powers Act. They've declared that, first, it's not an emergency. The trade deficit cannot be an emergency when it's been in place for 50 years. And second, they ruled that the president himself does not have the authority to impose tariffs like this. This is a congressional authority. So two courts have ruled against this, one that is a specific court for trade purposes and one a more general court. Those decisions have now been stayed. In other words, we are going to continue with the policy as it was while the appeal is heard. I assume this will go up to the Supreme Court, and we'll have to see whether the Supreme Court overturns these lower court rulings.
Deborah, we know that Trump's tariffs have been used as sort of a leverage when it comes to negotiating with different countries. But with all this legal uncertainty and twists and turns swirling around them, how does that impact ongoing or future trade talks? And could this be seen as a weakening of U.S. leverage?
It's possible. I think we will see a couple of different reactions from trade partners. There will be some who will say it's still in our interest to continue to negotiate because, particularly if the higher courts agree that Trump does have this authority, there is the potential for much higher tariffs to come into place in early July. So that's only a few weeks away. Some countries will be nervous enough about that to say we will proceed with the negotiations. Others are likely to say, well, until this all gets resolved domestically, we will either suspend our talks, although I doubt people will come out and say that. I think instead they will say, unfortunately, our calendar is busy until, mid-July or something. And so we'd love to talk to you, but we just have to wait until the schedule is clear, as a way of making sure that some of this domestic decision-making happens before you get into complicated negotiations bilaterally.
Well, Deborah, help us understand the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act by the Trump administration. I mean, what is the intent of the act? How has it been used before? Did the administration have grounds to use it? How flexible is the definition of national security under the IEPA?
Well, it's not about national security, although the law was created. It's a relatively obscure piece of legislation that has only been used, as I can recall, once. The idea here was that in times of actual emergency, as in war, the president needed to have a certain amount of flexibility to suspend or change rules. And so that's what the intent was behind IEPA. And nobody has really used it much since until Trump came along and then declared that under this IEPA, which is a very, if you read it, it's surprisingly sort of thin on its details, that this gave him justification to impose tariffs across the globe, actually, for what he claims now are two different emergencies. One is fentanyl from Canada, Mexico, and China. And the second was this trade deficit issue. So two different emergencies, same statute, both of which were overturned by lower courts and now stayed by a higher court on appeal. So the argument that he's trying to make is that this is something that the president can do. The president can do it unilaterally. The president does not need to consult with Congress or anyone else. And he can use tariffs as the tool to achieve his objectives in this time of emergency. And that's what's in dispute right now. Let me just say before we go any further, that does not mean that all tariff abilities by the president are overturned or at least are on appeal. Only the use of this particular statute called IEPA. And what is of concern to many governments is other actions that this administration has taken, especially on national security, these Section 232 tariffs that currently apply to metal products, autos, auto parts, and that are coming and probably much faster than we expect now, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, critical minerals, lumber, copper. I mean, there's a whole long line of things that they're prepared to discuss as a national security issue, meaning the president can impose tariffs in that space.
Okay, you mentioned earlier that the Trump administration could take this legal battle all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, if it gets there, how is the court likely to approach this case?
That is a great question that everyone is currently grappling with. I mean, the Supreme Court has been fairly deferential to the president thus far. But the first court that made this decision yesterday is a specialized court set up specifically for these trade issues. And while the Supreme Court, I suspect, will take the case, they may be reluctant to overturn a specialized court that they set up specifically to deal with trade issues. I don't know. All the lawyers, of course, are back and forth with their ideas about whether or not this is likely to proceed or be reversed on appeal. It's unclear, and it's unclear how long this will take. And so during the process of appealing these cases, it is likely that the tariffs will continue to be collected. If the government loses the appeal at the very end, then at some point it's possible that all of these tariffs collected under IEEPA will have to be returned. The return will not be automatic. So I would say to companies who are listening, at some point you could get the tariffs back, but you will have to apply for that. And so keep an eye open and an ear open for when or if this ever gets overturned and what the process will be for you to get your tariffs back.
There is already talk of workarounds, right? Peter Navarro said the administration will find another way to impose tariffs even if the courts reject the justification. What sort of options are realistically on the table for the Trump team?
Well, there are two that are the easiest. One is just to continue to use this national security argument. And you can see that the Trump administration is very enthusiastic about that. It's now got nine different areas under review or imposed already. So national security is good. And that allows the president a lot of flexibility to just declare that it's a national security issue. The challenge with that is that it's hard to declare, for example, a national security in stuffed animals and children's toys. So if you really wanted to go against an entire spectrum of goods, it's hard to make a national security argument for some of them. The second challenge is that it does take a certain amount of time. And so you could do national security arguments, and I think they will continue to do so. Another statute that they have available to them is something called Section 301, which simply declares a trade partner to be unfair. And then under that category, you could do an awful lot of damage. And I would note that the U.S. has an existing Section 301 case against China. So if it wants to go after China specifically, it can draw on its previous decisions on Section 301 made in the first Trump administration. It could also open Section 301 cases against others. There is broad authority by the president to do a lot of things under Section 301. And then finally, there's a bunch of sort of really small, obscure rules that do allow or do appear to allow the president to use tariffs as a response. Many of them have not been tested, so we don't know how they would be applied. But there are a number of tools that the president has. And then finally, I could just say that some of this would be resolved if Congress either authorized the tariffs or authorized the emergency or both. Because the court ruling in the case that we just had yesterday, the court said that the president doesn't have the authority to declare an emergency and impose tariffs, but Congress does. So if Congress turned around and said, this is an emergency and we think tariffs are a great idea, then you would solve this particular problem the Trump administration finds itself in. But you'd have to get Congress to go along with that.
All right, Deborah, appreciate your time. Deborah Elms, the head of trade policy at Hinrich Foundation.